For more than 100 years, engineers have dreamed of flooding one of the most desolate places on Earth, with seawater to generate electricity that never stops. The Qattara Depression Project would channel Mediterranean water into a massive basin sitting far below sea level, using nothing but gravity and evaporation to produce hydroelectric power indefinitely. Presidents have approved it, international teams have studied it, and at one point, someone proposed digging the canal with hydrogen bombs. And yet not a single shovel of dirt has been moved, which raises an obvious question about what keeps stopping one of history's most ambitious geoengineering proposals from ever breaking ground. Understanding why engineers have spent a century obsessing over this project requires knowing what the Qattara Depression actually is. Northwestern Egypt contains this teardrop-shaped basin roughly 55 to 80 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast, and it covers approximately 19,600 square kilometers, which makes it comparable to Lake Ontario and roughly twice the size of Lebanon. The basin stretches nearly 300 kilometers from east to west and reaches up to 145 kilometers wide. But what makes it extraordinary for engineering purposes sits below the surface. 133 meters below sea level marks the lowest point, making it the second lowest spot on the African continent after Lake Assal in Djibouti. Northern escarpments rise dramatically, reaching heights of up to 280 meters. Salt pans, sand dunes, and salt marshes dominate this harsh and nearly lifeless terrain. Only about 300 people live here, clustered in the small Kara oasis on the western side. That isolation is precisely what attracted engineers looking for a place to build something unprecedented. The depression takes its name from a spring called Ain el Qattara, meaning dripping in Arabic, a fitting name for a place defined by the near-total absence of water. Albrecht Penck, a German geographer and professor at the University of Berlin, first proposed flooding the Qattara Depression back in 1912. He recognized that the enormous elevation difference between the Mediterranean Sea and the depression floor could generate hydroelectric power. The concept works like this. Water from the Mediterranean flows through a canal or tunnel, dropping more than 100 meters through pressurized conduits called penstocks to spin turbines. That water collects in the depression and gradually forms an artificial inland sea. And here's where Egypt's brutal climate becomes an asset rather than a liability. Evaporation rates in this region reach 4.5 to 5 millimeters per day. At the proposed design level of 60 meters below sea level, the artificial lake would lose approximately 19 billion cubic meters of water annually, just from evaporation. New Mediterranean water constantly flows in to replace what disappears, dropping over 100 meters each time, and that constant inflow generates continuous hydroelectric power. The system could run indefinitely without fuel costs, powered entirely by gravity and the desert sun. Engineers envisioned a lake covering approximately 12,000 square kilometers with a volume of 227 cubic kilometers. Filling it would require roughly 600 to 700 cubic meters of water per second flowing continuously for about 10 years. John Ball, an English geologist serving as director of the Survey of Egypt, moved the project from concept to serious study through scientific measurements beginning in 1917. A British Army officer took initial elevation readings on his behalf that year, and verification surveys followed in 1924 and 1925 under surveyor G.F. Walpole. October 1927 brought Ball's findings to the Geographical Journal, where he officially named the basin Qattara and documented its extraordinary depth. His most significant contribution came 6 years later in October 1933 with a formal proposal titled The Qattara Depression of the Libyan Desert and the possibility of its utilization for power production. Ball's calculations suggested the project could generate between 125 and 200 megawatts of electricity, and he determined that 56.7 million cubic meters of water could flow into the depression daily while maintaining equilibrium with evaporation. Attention from the highest levels of Egyptian government followed. Hussein Seri Pasha, Undersecretary of the Egyptian Ministry of Works, presented the project to the Egyptian Scientific Council in 1931. The 1960s and 1970s brought the project's most controversial phase under Friedrich Basler, a German hydraulic engineer and professor at Technische Hochschule Darmstadt. Basler led an international board of advisors, and completed the first comprehensive pre-feasibility study in 1973. His analysis suggested the project could ultimately generate up to 5,800 megawatts when combined with pumped storage facilities, far exceeding Ball's original estimates. But the excavation method he proposed stands out as the most striking element of his work. Conventional digging through the rocky El Difa Plateau would require removing 1 to 2 cubic kilometers of material across 55 to 80 kilometers. Basler's alternative called for 213 hydrogen bombs, each yielding 1 to 1.5 megatons, which works out to approximately 100 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Workers would detonate them at depths of 100 to 500 meters along the proposed canal route, vaporizing rock and creating the channel through successive underground explosions. The Egyptian Atomic Energy Establishment had first postulated this nuclear excavation method in 1971, and it fit within President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace framework, envisioning peaceful applications for nuclear technology. Egyptian scientists rejected the plan. F.N. Ibrahim wrote in GeoJournal in 1982 that the dangerous impact of nuclear explosions was expected to cause seismic vibrations, atmospheric pressure waves, and radioactive fallout potentially extending to densely populated Cairo and Alexandria. Operation Plowshare's termination in 1977 and international treaties prohibiting peaceful nuclear explosions ended the nuclear excavation option for good. Planning continued through conventional methods despite the nuclear setback. The Egyptian government commissioned a formal feasibility study in 1975, conducted by joint venture Qattara, a German-led consortium. Multiple development phases emerged from the study. Phase 1 would establish an initial power station called Qattara 1, generating 670 megawatts. Phase 2 would add another 1,200 megawatts, and a pumped storage system could eventually bring the total to approximately 5,800 megawatts. November 1980 brought presidential approval when Anwar Sadat endorsed the project in principle, with cost estimates at the time ranging from $2 to $8 billion. Construction never started. Technical challenges, competing priorities, financing difficulties, and growing environmental concerns combined to stall progress, and the Depression remained untouched. What's interesting is that the CIA had proposed the Qattara project to President Eisenhower back in 1957, listing 4 benefits. They described it as spectacular and peaceful, claimed it would materially alter the climate in adjacent areas, suggested it would provide work during construction and living areas afterward for Palestinian Arabs, and noted it would get President Gamal Abdel Nasser's mind on other matters, because he needed some way to get off the Soviet hook. Eisenhower said no. Environmental science matured through the late 20th century, and concerns about the project mounted along with it. Groundwater presents the most serious issue. The Mogra Aquifer lies directly beneath the depression, and according to a 1991 study by Risk and Davis published in the journal Groundwater, model predictions indicated that creating the reservoir could cause a 30-meter rise in the water table in the central part of the depression. Saltwater intrusion could contaminate the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, the world's largest fossil water system, which irrigates agricultural land throughout Egypt's western desert. Once contaminated with salt, that water cannot be recovered. Wildlife also inhabits the depression despite its barren appearance. Conservation assessments identify it as habitat for one of Egypt's last cheetah populations, with the most recent confirmed sighting in 1997, along with Dorcas and slenderhorned gazelles. One Earth's ecoregion assessment states bluntly that the Hydro project proposal will devastatingly impact the whole area by destroying existing natural habitats, contaminating non-renewable fossil groundwater used to irrigate arable land, increasing seismic activity, and changing the atmospheric moisture regime. Another problem rarely gets discussed. Any artificial lake created would inevitably become hypersaline as evaporation concentrates salt over decades, eventually exceeding Dead Sea salinity levels of 300 to 400 grams per liter. That eliminates any potential for fisheries or tourism-based recreation. Military history shaped the Qattara Depression during World War II, and that legacy still affects the project today. The First and Second Battles of El Alamein in 1942 turned the depression into a natural barrier that prevented German forces from outflanking Allied positions from the south. Steep cliffs, salt lakes, and fine powdered sand called fetch made the terrain impassable for tanks, and both sides laid extensive minefields throughout the region. Millions of unexploded World War II ordnance and landmines remain scattered across the area today. Any serious construction effort would require extensive and expensive demining operations before work could even begin. Decades of dormancy ended when the project resurfaced in 2023. April 11, 2023, brought an agreement between Egypt Consulting, the Egyptian Group for International Trade and Consulting, and Elite Capital and Company Limited of London to conduct a new feasibility study. 4 elements form the focus: hydrogen energy, agriculture, industry, and modern mining. And notably, the study comes at no cost to the Egyptian government. Dr. Ehab Anwar, CEO of Egypt Consulting, stated that the Qattara Depression Project is expected to contribute to the Egyptian economy by providing new jobs and increasing Egypt's GDP. George Matharu, president and CEO of Elite Capital, described it as the largest green project in the world. August 21, 2023, brought another agreement when Elite Capital signed with the Arab Organization for Industrialization, an Egyptian state-owned industrial entity, covering the second phase of the study. Egyptian Ministry of Electricity and Energy Development plans list the project with a proposed capacity of 1,800 megawatts. Announcements promised feasibility study results within months of the April 2023 signing, but no public findings have appeared. December 2024 assessments indicate no such project is yet being seriously considered for implementation. Current cost estimates for the full project range from $3 to $9 billion depending on the source. The Qattara Depression Project stands as one of engineering's most persistent what-ifs. Every generation for over a century has looked at this massive hole in the Egyptian desert and imagined what it could become. Technical soundness remains intact. Gravity still works, the sun still evaporates water, and the depression still sits 133 meters below sea level. But the same factors that stalled the project since 1912 remain unresolved. Enormous upfront costs, environmental risks to irreplaceable groundwater, destruction of habitat for endangered species, and the fundamental question of whether the investment makes sense when Egypt's desert conditions grow increasingly ideal for solar power. Technology might solve these challenges someday. Environmental concerns might find engineering solutions not yet developed, or the Qattara Depression Project might remain exactly what it has always been: a magnificent idea that exists primarily in feasibility studies and the imagination of engineers. The dream of an artificial sea in the Sahara isn't going anywhere. 100 years of waiting already passed, and a little longer won't make much difference. If you made it this far and want more stories about ambitious engineering and megaprojects from around the world, subscribe to Worldwide Arch and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next.